Good day, everyone. I am Jeremy Midgela. I'm from BSSW1C student, and we are the Group 5 reporters. So, in our group, we have three topics that will be discussed: the social issues and problems of different sectors of the Philippine society, their situation, needs, issues, and struggles from a gender lens. First, the street families or homeless. Second, the workers. And last but not the least, the indigenous people.
Good morning everyone, especially to our instructor Mr. Eliseo. So maayong buntag sa atong tananog sa imo sir. The topic that I am going to deliver to you this time is all about the homeless and the street families in the Philippines. So homelessness and street family was one of the most social issue and problem of the Republic of the Philippines. So kabalot ta nga we had a lot of social issues nga atong ginaatubang karon diri sa Pilipinas, but still homelessness is the most and rare case karon nga ginaatubang gid diri sa Philippines. So before the pandemic, there were already an estimated 3 million homeless people in the city of Manila. So kabantay man sa siguro ta na sa mga news nga sa Manila gyud grabe kadaghan ang mga taong kalye dito. Before ang pandemic ni abot, so naanay estimated 3 million homeless people dito lang na sa Manila alone. Maka-realize din ta how much more pag-abot sa pandemic at which kanang daghan mga establishment nga nanirado, daghan mga infrastructures nga nanirado nga nagresult nga mawad-an na og trabaho ang mga tao. The Philippines is one of the fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia. Bisan og ang Philippines is fastest growing economies diri sa Southeast Asia, but still sulod sa Philippines nagatubang ang Philippines og crisis nga mao ang daghan kayo homeless people diri ko makita nato no 4.5 million homeless people kung ato nang imagine unsa na kadaghan including pagyod ang mga children no at which nagtotal tanan og 106 million. What do most homeless families consist of? Okay, according to the 2010 AHR or the annual homeless assessment report, a typical homeless family consists of a mother and two children, and people in the family experiencing homelessness are more likely to be headed by women to identify as minorities and are significantly less likely to have disability. Nakabantay ba ta nga kasagara is mga babae? Mga babae ang si tawag ani mga babae ang kanang naasa daplin sa dalan dayon kabitbit og mga anak. And now ato pong mabalaan kung unsa bay rason sa ilang situation. Ay upat lang pod nga ato yung i-describe gyud sa kanang reasons gyud sa pagiging homeless. So number 1, poverty, normal. So the unemployment rate in the Philippines is low. Low income can make it difficult for many families in the Philippines, especially those living in Manila, to pay rent. So makita nato mabalaan ginato nga ang employment rate gid diri sa Philippines is grabe gid ka ubos, grabe gid ka low. Normal kung low ang employment, so low income pod. Number 2 dayon is domestic violence. So women and children in the Philippines are in danger of domestic abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. Muna sila kasagara ang reasons kanang naay mga partner, isang lugar ang babae, naay partner nga giabusaran siya sa iyang partner, bisan ang bata, bisan giabusaran siya sa iyang papa bakaha, mao din ang mahimong rason nga mo migrate siya, mulakaw siya sa ilang balay, which results nga mahimo silang homeless. Human trafficking. So isa pod, many traffic victims are promised jobs in the cities. However, after moving to a city, they are exploited and forced into prostitution. Okay. So naay uban nga mga kababaihan naay mag-promise sa ilang nga naay trabaho, then pag-abot na dito sa ilang trabahoan, lahi day ang ilang nasudlan day tungod kay exploit sila o i-prostitute sila. Natural disaster, kung mabagyuhan ang inyong balay, maguba, mawad na mo og balay, di ba? Wala na mo'y mapuy-an. No? So some families have lost their homes due to natural disasters such as typhoons, earthquakes, and volcano eruption. Why homelessness is a problem? Anong problema man gid siya? Although yes, kanang makita nato, ma-picture out nato nga homelessness o nabala nato ganin na nga it is the crisis that the state of the Philippines are facing today. Why is it a problem gyud, no? Homelessness is a complex social problem with a variety of underlying economic and social factors such as poverty, lack of affordable housing, uncertain physical and mental health, addiction and community and family breakdown. So karon, natay types of homeless families, no? According to modified conditional cash transfer for homeless street families or the MCCT HSF, ang homeless families was categorized into 4 category. Okay. So number 1, families on the street A or ako na siyang gimark as A kay duha man sila pareha sa una ug sa sunod. Ang una, families on the street represent 75% of homeless population. They are families who earn their livelihood on the street but eventually return to their original communities. So ang una nga category, sila daw ang nagrepresent sa 75% of the homeless population kung asa nanginabuhi sila dira nagyapon sa mga kadalanan pero ni balik nagyapon sila sa ilang original nga mga communities. Number 2 din karon is the families on the street mo gyapon pero gimark na ako ni siya as B, which is the families of the street are families who live on the street for a long time and have created communities among themselves. So sila pod ang mga grupo sa mga homeless families nga dugay na nga mga panahon nagpuyo dira sa daplin sa mga dalan, matawag na nato nga naka-create sila og organization sa ilang grupo. Ang ikatulo, which is the displaced homeless families. Okay, unsa man ning displaced homeless families? They are the families who have lost their homes due to natural disaster or live in their communities. So sila ang mga victims of natural disasters nga nangaguba ang ilang balay. This category also include families and children who may have escaping abuses at home. So they are under the category of displaced homeless family. So ika-4, community-based street families are families who are from rural communities but moved to urban areas from a better way of life. So gikan sila sa kanang rural community, ni-move sila into urban areas para makakita sila og mga mas maayo pa nga panginabuhian. Pero og ni-move na sila sa urban, nibalik lang gyapon sila sa rural area kung asa sila gikan. So that category of the homeless family are called to be a community-based street families. So inclusion pod sa mga population which are homeless are the homeless children. So children lived home and end up on the street because of excessive beating from their parents, poverty, or sexual exploitation. So mao to ganina, isa gid sa mga pinakarason, di ba? Makita nato ganina is ang domestic abuse. Nakita nato dito nga inclusion sa domestic abuse kung ang papa giabusaran nila ang ilang partner, nagresult na dayon nga ang mga bata sad normal apektado sad ang mga bata. So ang bata mula ka og balay tungod sa ilang mga ginikanan, then moadto na din sila sa mga kalikalye. Then the children is also sila gid ang mahimong mga matawag nga mga criminals dayon tungod kay wala man sila yung mga pangita, wala man sila yung mga makita nga mga trabaho. So dira din sa mga dalan-dalan mo din nakasagara karon nga ang mga bata mahimong mga wat na lang tungod kay walay pagkaon, wala sila natiman sa ilang mga ginikanan, nipuyo na lang pud sila sa daplin sa mga kadalanan. Nahimo gid gyapon silang sexual exploited gyapon ang mga kabataan. So how can we solve homelessness in the Philippines? So number 1, a coordinated approach. Isa sa pinaka-importante gid nga dira sa mga lugar na ay delivery of services, labi na sa housing, daghan pod mga program nga kailangan i-build muna ma-motivate po din ang mga tao sa community. So number 2, housing as the solution. Normal. The solution of homeless is simple. Housing. Kay homeless man sila, they need home. Tungod kay wala sila home. No, housing is the solution. Assistance for the most vulnerable. So, katong most vulnerable na ang mga bata, dapat gyud direct assistance para sa ila. Designing a crisis response. Naagay mga response sa mga crisis nga gakahitabo. The number 5 dayon, increasing employment and income. I-increase sa Philippines ang employment ug ang income. So mao gini sila ang isa sa mga tip gyud para ma-solve gyud ang homelessness. So we have this NSP or the National Shelter Program. It is a program which designed to assist the homeless, in particular the informal settler families or the ISFs, and the low-income and middle-income Filipino families. It has three major components, namely regulation, finance, and production. That's it. Salamat sa pagpaminaw. I hope nasabtan na sa ninyo. God bless sa atong tanan og maayong adlaw.
Good day, everyone. So, our topic for today is all about social issues and problems of different sectors of the Philippine society, their situations, needs, issues, and struggle from a gender lens, street family, homeless, workers, and the indigenous people. But from now, I will be tackled about social issues and problems of the different sectors of the Philippine society, the workers. For now, let's talk about the 8 issues that arrest the employment of Filipinos. So the first one is the unemployment due to Boracay closure. Over 30,000 workers in Boracay lost income after the island was closed off from tourists for 6 months, supposedly for its much needed rehabilitation. Prior to the closure, no detailed plan was issued to address the impending revenue and jobless losses during the rehab period. The second, diplomatic mistakes that endanger OFWs' jobs. The growing diplomatic dispute between the Philippines and Kuwait left more than 260,000 overseas Filipino workers uncertain of their physical and professional security. President Duterte imposed a deployment ban to the Arab country in February, following the discovery of the body of a Filipino worker in a freezer there. So, while the government said it would be a temporary policy which will be lifted once there is an agreement with Kuwait, Duterte said it is permanent. The third, pilfering that lead to the termination of MESCAR employees. Last January, longtime aviation service provider MESCAR lost the trust of key airports in the country, and in turn, left nearly 4,000 people jobless after a luggage theft incident that earned the ire of the president. The fourth, unfortunate effect of train law. The government tax reform for acceleration and inclusion law may be a win for some, but others argue it as ill-conceived in relation to the low-income Filipino and the poor. The fifth, a hole in the plan for drivers in jeepney modernization. The Department of Transportation's Public Utility Vehicle Modernizations Program orders the slow phase-out of jeepneys of at least 15 years old to make way for the modernized version. The sixth, fishermen afraid of China's civilian force. The arbitral tribunal that ruled in favor of the Philippines in 2016 declared the Scarborough Shoal, which the Philippines calls Panatagan, open fishing ground to be enjoyed by fishermen in the region. The seventh, PBO industry slowing down. The Asian Development Bank state in a report that the Philippines university are not producing graduates who are competitive enough for higher position in the business processing outsourcing sector. And lastly, the Indo problem that does not end. partido ng manggagawa state that they were dismayed with the president's executive order and that they in for another waiting game. So that is the 8 recent issues that raise the employment of Filipinos.
Hello everyone, I'm here again. In this time, I will be the one to discuss the indigenous peoples topic. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. The number of the Philippines' indigenous peoples remains unknown, but it is estimated to be between 10% and 20% of the 102.9 million national population. The population census conducted in the Philippines in 2010 for the first time included an ethnicity variable, but no official figure for indigenous peoples has been released yet. The country's indigenous population thus continues to be estimated at between 10% and 20% of the national population of 100,981,437 based on the 2015 population census. The indigenous groups in the northern mountains of Luzon or Cordillera are collectively known as Igorot, while the groups on the southern island of Mindanao are collectively called Lumad. So, mayroong mas maliliit na grupo na sama-samang kilala bilang Mangyan sa isla ng Mindoro, gayon din ang mas maliliit nakakalat na grupo sa mga isla ng Visayas at Luzon, kabilang ang ilang grupo ng mga mangangasong gatherers sa paglipat. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have retained much of their traditional, pre-colonial culture, social institutions, and livelihood practices. They generally live in geographically isolated areas with a lack of access to basic social services and few opportunities for mainstream economic activities, education, or political participation. In contrast, ang mga likas na yaman na may halaga sa komersyo tulad ng mga mineral, kagubatan at ilog ay matatagpuan pangunahin sa kanilang mga lugar. Ginagawa itong patuloy na mahina sa pagsalakay, sa pag-unlad, at pangangamkam ng lupa. The Republic Act 8371, known as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act or IPRA, was promulgated in 1997. The law has been lauded for its support for respect of indigenous peoples, cultural integrity, right to their lands, and right to self-directed development of those lands. More substantial implementation of the law is still being sought. However, apart from there being fundamental criticism of the law itself. So the Philippines voted in favor of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or UNDRIP. Muna siya yung acronym. But the government has not yet ratified ILO Convention 169. So next is the COVID-19 response and impacts. So this situation affected indigenous communities in the country and disrupted the people's economic, political, and social lives. Many lost their livelihoods, some were stranded in communities and cities with limited access to food supplies, basic health services, or testing for COVID-19. So, indigenous organizations responded to the pandemic by conducting relief operations, producing information materials on the virus and how to protect oneself, and marketing local products to provide a source of income for farmers. So, these efforts were undermined by the military in some areas where they dropped flyers from helicopters warning people not to avail themselves of relief goods being distributed by alleged front organizations of communist terrorists. The use of indigenous knowledge and practices such as traditional community quarantine and herbal remedies was also reported. Dumating ang pandemya sa gitna ng lumalalang sitwasyon ng karapatang pantao sa ilalim ng administrasyon ni Pangulong Duterte. Sa pagtulak na ipatupad ang mga neoliberal na programang pang-ekonomiya nito at wakasan ang komunistang insurhensya sa 2022. So, ipinagpatuloy ng gobyerno ang tinatawag nitong digmaan laban sa droga. So, war on drug. Pinatindi ang mga operasyong kontra insurhensya at pinaigting ang pampulitikang panunupil. Legislation affecting indigenous peoples. On March 24, 2020, the Philippine Congress passed the Bayanihan to Hell as One Act, Republic Act No. 11469, declaring a state of national emergency, creating an interagency task force to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, imposing penalties for violations of the law, and granting the President additional authority to appropriate funds in order to finance stimulus packages and development projects. So the Bayanihan Act was shortly followed by Republic Act No. 11332, creating guidelines for enhanced community quarantine or ECQ. Together, these two laws were used to push Duterte's development agenda while inhibiting public mobilization and protest. Indigenous organizations criticized the law for its provisions, which facilitated further violations of the people's civil, political, and socio-economic rights. On June 4, 2020, accelerated recovery and investments stimulus for the economy of the Philippines, Arise Philippines, was passed. This followed on 27 in July 2020 by the passage of the Bayanihan to Recover as One Act, Bayanihan Act 2, providing for COVID-19 response and recovery interventions and establishing mechanisms to accelerate recovery and bolster the resilience of the Philippine economy. So, ginagamit ni Pangulong Duterte ang kanyang executive powers sa ilalim ng mga batas na ito para ilihis at angkop ang mga pundo para sa pagtugon sa COVID-19, gayon din para punduhan ang mga proyektong pang-infrastruktura na natatanggap ng stimulus support. On July 3, 2020, Republic Act No. 11479 or the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 was passed by Congress and signed into law by the President. Anti-Terrorism Council or the ATC, composed of cabinet officials, which is authorized to designate individuals and organizations as terrorists. It sets up an Anti-Terrorism Council or the ATC, composed of cabinet officials, which is authorized to designate individuals and organizations as terrorists. So as a whole, the law is unconstitutional and violates the principle of the separation of powers of the different branches of government. Okay, next is the attacks on indigenous peoples. Following the issuance of Executive Order 70 by President Duterte in December 2018, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict or the NTF-ELCAC accelerated the government's counter-insurgency program in 2020. Under the leadership of the National Security Advisor and the Chair of the National Commission and Indigenous Peoples or the NCIP, the NTF-ELCAC aims not only to crush the armed resistance in the countryside but also to stop the alleged support coming from city-based progressive legal organizations. The NTF-ELCAC is actively red-tagging indigenous organizations. Their leaders support NGOs and advocates, resulting in a marked increase in violations of the individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples. Comprehensive campaign to discredit and delegitimize indigenous organizations. The government is targeting indigenous peoples' organizations using a combination of various strategies through the judicial, legislative, and executive branches. State laws and institutions such as the military, courts, police, local government units, and national government agencies are weaponized to attack indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, and deny them access to justice. Terrorist tagging worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic and is expected to intensify with the implementation of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. The military has been using numerous Facebook accounts to spread lies, sow intrigue, and destroy the reputation of indigenous leaders who are good standing citizens. One example is the case of Cordillera Peoples Alliance, or the CPA chair Wendell Bolingit, who has been a victim of numerous malicious social media posts against him and his family. So from March to May 2020, the Save Our Schools or SOS network documented 32 attacks on Lumad schools, including forced closure, illegal arrest of students, and aerial bombings. Next, criminalization, Trump up charges, killing. Republic Act No. 10591 or the Comprehensive Firearms and Ammunition Regulation Act has been used to falsely accuse, criminalize, arrest, and detain indigenous peoples. So among the recent victims is Beatriz Belen, a staunch leader from Oma Kalinga, active in the fight against the Chevron geothermal project in their community. So she was arrested on October 25, 2020 after an illegal search on false charges of illegal possession of explosives. So in Mindanao, Gloria Tumalon, a Manubo indigenous activist and opponent of mining projects, was arrested in the Surigao del Sur. Tumalon was one of 468 people accused of being an NPA. In Zambales, for indigenous Aita community members, 2 male farmers and 2 female miners were illegally arrested and subjected to torture such as force feeding of faces by the military. Japper Gurong and Junior Ramos were arrested while evacuating with their families from their ancestral land due to ongoing military operations. And then continuing development aggression. In July 2020, Sagittarius Mines Incorporation or SMI, developer of the US $5.9 million Tampakan copper gold project located in indigenous Balaan territory in South Cotabato, reacquired its environmental compliance certificate or ESCC, one of the requirements needed to proceed to the commercial production phase. Another example is the Kaliwa Canal and Layban dams in Quezon and Rizal provinces, which will displace thousands of indigenous and remontado in order to supply water to Metro Manila. Department of Agriculture or DA and National Commission on Indigenous Peoples NCIP jointly proposed implementing the Plant program in by targeting the ancestral lands of the Lumad as idle lands. So that's all for our reporting. Thank you and God bless us all.